Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us on this webinar about modern slavery in the financial sector. This is a very important topic, and many of you will have read the media coverage over the last few weeks, which sadly shows as a timely reminder of both how close to home this crime is and the impact on human lives, those victims who become ensnared and trapped in horrendous conditions that it's often very hard or near impossible to escape from. Over the next hour or so, we'll be discussing some of the early findings of our research programme and debating on some challenging questions about the role of lenders, investors, banks, building societies, accountancy firms, payments and money service businesses, currency exchanges, and frankly, all financial institutions in addressing this important issue. I'm delighted to welcome so many of our wonderful guests to this webinar. We want to hear all your views on the matter, and so we'll come to you with a number of audience polls, but please also ask as many questions as you want. Well, I'll start with our panelists talking about the genesis of this research. There'll hopefully be plenty of time for a Q&A panel, so please do join in and we'll ask as many of your questions as possible to our esteemed panel. On that note, I'm really pleased to introduce today's speakers to lead this important discussion and answer any questions you have. First, Dame Sara Thornton, the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who really needs no further introduction, but is tirelessly championing and leading the UK's response to modern-day slavery. Tom Sancliffe, founder of the Tribe Freedom Foundation, and Jonathan Bell, Senior Partner at Red Compass. So the recent media exposure of modern slavery in Leicester is sadly a timely reminder that as financial sector leaders, we all have an important and significant role to play and a level of influence that can help tackle modern day slavery and human trafficking, whether it be through careful due diligence of our own clients, our suppliers and our staff, or through a greater degree of challenge to those that we lend to or invest in. We're reaching out to as many financial institutions of all shapes and sizes as part of a 9-month research programme commissioned by Dame Sara and jointly led by Themis and the Tribe Freedom Foundation. The study aims to improve the understanding of how the financial sector can do more to mitigate the risks of modern-day slavery and human trafficking through their own business operations, their supply chains and their investments, and provide a collective industry response to tackling this issue. This is a really important piece of industry-wide research, and we're looking for representatives across the whole sector to take part. Our aim is to understand current best practices and drive an industry-wide response, together with a practical toolkit that will help all financial institutions be better equipped to detect suspicions of modern slavery. Dame Sara, I know this is a subject you've been championing for some time. You outlined in your strategy presented to Parliament back in October last year the important role that the financial sector can play in fighting modern slavery. Could you tell us a little bit more about this project and why you're so keen to see banks and investors and other financial institutions getting involved?
When we talk about tackling modern slavery, we often talk about protecting victims and prosecuting those who traffic our fellow human beings. But the third P, prevent, is just as important. The way in which businesses can become much more resilient to those sorts of crimes to prevent the traffickers getting a hold. And while governments have a role and consumers have a role, businesses also have a huge role. And of course, financial institutions that lend to those businesses, who invest in those businesses, are in such a position to influence, such a unique position to help businesses and demand that businesses take the issues of modern slavery seriously. I think that unique position is not kind of fully realised yet. While there have been efforts led by civil society to increase awareness, they've tended to be piecemeal and not a comprehensive and coordinated approach. So we think there's a real opportunity to have a much more comprehensive strategy, thinking about how financial institutions can assess and tackle modern slavery risks right across the piece. So this really important project, where I've been working collaboratively with both Themis and the Tribe Freedom Foundation, is to try and fill that gap, to think about some of the good ideas that are out there and to really make the case for a much more industry-wide strategy with kind of concrete steps in which financial institutions can all both identify, but most importantly, prevent modern slavery from happening in the first place.
Thank you, Dame Sara, and that's really clear. Thank you. Let's first consider the question with our audience then. So, is modern slavery relevant to us? In our early research, we had some surprising findings, so I want to check in with the audience today and see what you think. So our first poll for this morning's session, you've got the question there: how many victims of modern day slavery are there in the UK? You should be able to vote quite simply. Just press the one that you think is most relevant. Whilst you're doing that, interesting to note that some of the findings of our research is that awareness of modern slavery in the financial sector is sadly quite low. In fact, polling conducted of this project so far revealed that 3 in 10 financial services employees do not believe that modern slavery is something that occurs in the UK. And slightly unexpectedly, that increased to 39% amongst those at middle manager level, and an even more shocking 45% amongst board level managers and directors. So what does that say about the state of the sector? I suspect we have some more informed champions on the call today, so let's see what you think there. So yes, 50% of you believe that there are over 136,000 victims of slavery in the UK, which is correct. It's a huge issue, both globally and nationally. So globally, over 40 million people are estimated to be trapped in modern slavery, and 136,000 of these victims are in the UK. Tom, and that's pretty outstanding in terms of the scale of the issue. Could you tell us a little bit more about the scale of what we're dealing with here, both in the UK and globally?
Well, Dickon, you're quite right. It is a massive issue in the UK. I mean, modern slavery is one of the top 3 most lucrative forms of organised crime globally, alongside drug trafficking and counterfeit goods. I mean, it's estimated that modern slavery generates up to 150 billion for organised criminal gangs per year. And actually 47 billion of that is happening in developed countries such as the UK. So it's very much not the case that modern slavery is just an issue relevant in kind of places outside the UK. It's very much a global problem that affects all of us. And ultimately, we're obviously living in very difficult times as a result of COVID. And one of the much talked about consequences of that is going to be, something like 200 million jobs being lost globally. So I think this needs to be right at the top of our agenda, because people have never been more vulnerable to slavery and trafficking in a sense than they have been today. So I think it's definitely a great timing for the report, because I think it should be right at the top of everyone's agenda.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dame Sara, as in your position as the UK Anti-Slavery Commissioner, would you add anything to that?
No, I think I was just going to pick up on the point that Tom makes, that the kind of health crisis that has rapidly become an economic crisis means that so many people have lost their jobs and lost their livelihoods. And my concern then is that people who are really desperate will think that exploited work is the best option that's available for them. It's the most rational option. But also businesses that have maybe been under a huge amount of pressure might be tempted to cut corners and to exploit labour just to try and get back on their feet. So I think we need to be super, super vigilant as we come out of this period and begin to build economies.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why our research is so timely and so important now, to build that kind of industry-wide response. What I would just say is our research focuses on 4 key themes, and I thought it would be useful to structure the rest of our discussion thematically around these chapters. So the first, entitled Monitor and Report, looks at how we can monitor our own businesses to see if there are any direct links to modern slavery and human trafficking across our clients, staff and supply chain, as well as the reporting expectations on our control environments. The second theme in our study is Detect and Disrupt, detecting the proceeds of crime linked to modern slavery and human trafficking that may be flowing through our financial networks. And thirdly, we look at invest and engage, looking at responsible investment and lending decisions and the influence lenders and investors have to use their financial muscle to prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. And finally, empower and support, looking at how firms can support survivors and engage your teams with supporting the victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. So we'll cover each of those sections in a short while, but for now I'd like to start with the section on detecting any direct links with modern slavery within our own businesses, be this with our clients, our suppliers, or our staff. Dame Sara, I wonder if you could start us off here. I think it's fair to say that being in compliance with the Modern Slavery Act is no longer enough, and that companies need to be going beyond compliance. Is this something that you agree with, or what would your position on that be?
Absolutely. As many people on the call will know, any business that's operating in the UK that's turning over more than 36 million a year has to write a modern slavery statement, setting out what they're doing to tackle modern slavery in their own organisation, but importantly in their supply chain. And while that was groundbreaking legislation back in 2015, I'm very sympathetic to calls for it to be tightened up and toughened up, because, you know, we rely on businesses to police their own supply chains, and it's absolutely clear that some do and that some don't. And I think that apart from legislation and enforcement, banks, investors have a key role to play in trying to ensure that businesses do the right thing, and they do in particular police their supply chains. I often say that it's not about what you say, but actually what you do. And it's not about minimal compliance. It's about saying, what does it really mean to be an ethical business? To be thinking about people and planet as well as profit. We published a report in June where we looked at mainly retailers, and we developed a maturity framework. And we were saying, you know, the very basic level is to be writing a modern slavery statement. The best companies are really thinking at board level about human rights due diligence, thinking about how do we gather information and intelligence from communities, from NGOs, how do we gather information from our own workers, what sort of engagement do we have with our workers, are we using apps, different forms of technology to improve that engagement, what are we doing to use data analytics to identify risk in supply chains, and are we really thinking about, you know, if this product is this price, how can we really have factored in the cost of labour? So a whole range of things that the very best companies are doing. And my view, and this is why I think this work is so important, that financial institutions are in such a strong position, both to drive action in businesses, but also to drive reporting standards and demand it as a kind of part of that investment approach.
Absolutely, and I think in the many calls that we've had with different financial institutions as part of that research, this is such an important stream, and it's really important that all the senior leaders on this call kind of really take note of that drive to first look inside your own businesses and see how much you are doing across your business to tackle modern slavery. Our second theme is looking not just at your own business lines, but actually the proceeds of crime flowing through the financial networks. So when we talk about detect and disrupt, and it's those links between the flow of illicit money coming through the system. And Jonathan, to those who say modern slavery is not relevant to the financial sector, and many people have said that, sadly, what would your response be? Are firms looking at the proceeds of modern slavery and bringing this within their financial crime controls or not?
Well, morning everybody. Yeah, good points, Dickon. I think to the question of whether they're connected or not, whether modern slavery, human trafficking is connected to financial organisations, I think the answer is unequivocally yes. I'll explain more in a few moments. And I think a question as to how much organisations are looking for the evidences of those proceeds coming from this type of business is probably a varied story at the moment, with certainly room for improvement. I guess we in Red Compass, we're delighted to be part of this research and to support the work that's going on to raise awareness and try to address this problem that we see all around us. We work in financial institutions, primarily across payments and core banking. So we see the data flows, and we have experience in data analytics to understand what that data is telling us. So just to kind of scale back a little bit and understand how these things are connected. We've seen over the years that wherever money moves, so there's a financial transaction that happens, there's a data flow that goes with that. And increasingly today, with this data and the tools available to us, we can understand the purpose of that payment, of that data flow, of that transaction. And that purpose, I guess, gives us insights into the story behind that payment. So for example, just to name a familiar example for myself, a tired commuter scans his phone in London Bridge Station before getting on the train to take that bar of chocolate, bit of a boost to get home before dinner, perhaps. Or a newly married couple put down a massive payment for them, certainly a deposit on a new home, their new home together. Or a grandmother living overseas sends some money back to the grandkids for their birthday or for Christmas or something. But what if the real story behind that transaction was that those same grandchildren were being bought and sold into modern slavery, and that money is moving through the financial structures that we have? We often say that we're proud to support the banks, and we're proud to support a strong banking environment and framework, because a strong society needs it. But since wherever money flows, crime inevitably follows, people being people, and we see this throughout history. Perpetrators of modern slavery and human trafficking will and do use this same structure, this same framework to move their money around. And this puts the banks and the money services businesses in a very dangerous position. We've seen in recent years many fines have been issued across many of the banks, and I don't need to name them, and that's driven a strong response to sorting out AML practices and processes, which has been great. And that gives us, I think, a great foundation to go further and do more, and particularly to focus in on this area. I think we would all agree that all organizations, whether financial institutions or others, have a responsibility, they certainly have a legal responsibility to monitor and to know what's going through their systems and to make sure that they're fulfilling their obligations. But there's a moral and a human responsibility there too, I think. I guess a recent case been in the news that struck me was that of Westpac over in Australia, the second largest bank there. They're sitting under the threat of a potential fine of 900 million Australian dollars from the regulators over in Australia for breaching anti-money laundering regulations. Allegedly, they failed to properly vet thousands and thousands of transactions that could be linked to child exploitation, a clear form of modern slavery today. The damage to those victims is beyond measure. The bank's share price was impacted, of course, it went down, and people lost their jobs at senior levels as a result. These banks are at risk if they're not actively looking for this data. And of course, closer to home, we've touched on it, I think, that the case of Boohoo up in Leicester, where the supply chain had some things in it as it started to become a bit clearer, and it's still coming out, of course. Working conditions, not what we would think them to be. And this is not in some far-flung corner of the world, it's right here on our doorstep. So this is a problem for us. So yes, we have responsibility to address this. But with responsibility comes, of course, a great opportunity. The fact that this money is moving through the financial systems enables the banks to look at data and to understand they have access to the data. So having access to the data is one thing. Getting it organized and knowing what to look for is key. So working together with the banks to identify these red flags. What is it that you need to spot in your data and your transactions that you can then go find and understand them? What patterns are pulling these together to enable you to go, that's a case, we need to deal with that. And it's one thing to know about it, we've got to be more proactive, I think, at looking for it, so actively look for it. We've got a regulatory requirement, of course, to do so. And you have fines on the table, but this is something that needs to be done. And I think part of our work is to help bring these things together, of understanding what to look for and how to find it in the data with the payments knowledge and the data science experience that we have. I guess our goal of working together with the financial organizations is to systematically disrupt modern slavery and human trafficking in this country, of course, by using this expertise blends to cut off that flow of money and make it impossible to use the banks to buy and sell people, thinking back to that grandma's example of her grandkids. It's people like that in our own families that can be at risk. So it's a massive problem, and the banks absolutely have a responsibility and an opportunity to take here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. I think what you say there is really important, actually, because again, sadly, some of our early research shows that whilst we've got some real champions out there in terms of financial institutions, there are still some organizations that aren't directly linking modern slavery within their financial crime kind of controls. And obviously a reminder to us all that the UK is an all crimes jurisdiction. So any proceeds from modern slavery and human trafficking represent a financial crime. And as you correctly say, Jonathan, you then have both a legal and a regulatory responsibility around that as well. So I think that's really interesting in terms of the two different ways of looking at it. Do you have any direct links within your own businesses, or are you able to detect the flows of illicit money coming through your financial networks? You also mentioned, Jonathan, the case of kind of recent news coverage of kind of poor working conditions in Leicester, and that's a really important one, not just to drive awareness of the issue, but also from an investor perspective. And I think our third chapter is a really, really important one, which deals with financial sectors' leverage or influence over their clients, using both the kind of carrot and the stick of capital, whether that be investment capital or lending capital. Tom, if I could maybe turn to you on this one. So how do we go about raising the profile of modern slavery and indeed human rights as a whole amongst the investment banks, private equity firms, VC platforms, as well as bank lenders? What role can investors and lenders play here?
Well, yeah, I mean, Dickon, I think it's been one of the big things we've been looking at in the research, actually, because I suppose the facts are, in a sense, very clear that there are something like 25 million victims of forced labour worldwide. It's estimated that 16 million of these are working in private sector supply chains. So the fact is, whether you're working in a kind of large financial institution in Canary Wharf or a FTSE listed company in London, that there are risks that, whether directly through your own supply chains or through the supply chains of your businesses, that you are connected to modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I think the real kind of responsibility and I suppose opportunity in terms of how we can prevent human trafficking is to look at how those financial institutions and those lending and financial institutions can stop human trafficking in their supply chains. And one of the things we've seen is some really exciting best practice emerging around particularly the kind of due diligence phase of the kind of investment process of financial institutions, and looking at how investors and lenders, through the questions they're asking during their due diligence and through the questions they're asking through the life cycle of their reporting and their investments, how can they shine a light on and hopefully expose modern slavery and human trafficking in the companies that they're investing in and lending to. And we think that ultimately, the more that investors and lenders are asking about modern slavery, the more business relevant modern slavery and human trafficking can become. And I think of all of the areas that change can happen, this is one of them.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think we're seeing actually some good response from the investor community, which is important. But I think here the thing is around actually having the guts to act on what you say and potentially withhold funds from either investments or lending decisions if you suspect instances of modern slavery and human trafficking. So I think a really strong part to play with that, and I'd like to come back to that maybe a little bit later in our Q&A. There is a kind of final theme of our research around empowering and supporting. And again, Tom, if I can turn back to you here. So you founded the Tribe Freedom Foundation to fight modern slavery and human trafficking, but particularly to support victims and survivors. And I guess here we're talking about financial inclusion, and access to banking services, which are kind of critical elements of reducing that vulnerability and enabling recovery. Can you share with us some of the ways in which banks are supporting victims, or financial institutions can help support victims of modern slavery and human trafficking as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you say, one of the kind of the founding journey that inspired the Tribe Freedom Foundation was actually a 1,000-mile run across Eastern Europe to set up the first home for trafficked children in the UK. And one of the things we've always been very focused on at the Tribe Freedom Foundation, in addition to our work around prevention of modern slavery, is thinking about survivor support. And obviously, you know, we're looking at lots of this work has focused on the kind of role of financial institutions, but I think there's definitely an important role to play in terms of victim support. And just to kind of look at kind of one really amazing initiative that's been led by a number of banks has been a survivor inclusion initiative, and that's all been about helping survivors navigate what can be a very complex process of setting up a bank account. And I suppose particularly when you think about the situation that victims of trafficking might be in, there are lots of reasons why they might find it quite difficult to set up a bank account. They might lack appropriate documentation to pass standard bank KYC standards. They might lack a fixed address. And what the projects we've been working with in the UK have found is that these survivor bank account initiatives can really be transformative for the self-confidence and the prosperity of trafficking survivors. And I think, you know, one of the key things that, you know, we always try and do with all the projects we support is look at that journey back from trafficking, and that very much is a long-term journey from a very difficult situation into, you know, hopefully reintegration to a sort of happy, prosperous life. And I think there are two aspects to these financial inclusion programs. Firstly, there is obviously the kind of the process of setting up the account, but also it's about coupling this with appropriate financial education, support and follow-up, just so that survivors are able to navigate their finances easily. And so I think that is just one example of a number of examples of really amazing best practice we've seen across the sector. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this report is bring together all of that best practice, because if everyone was doing what the best person was doing in any one area, we would be in such an amazingly different position. So what we're trying to do is kind of synthesize and bring together best practice. And obviously, survivor financial inclusion is one area, and the other area is we've seen some really amazing employee volunteering schemes that we'll also be looking at in the report, and that's really looking at how banks can do things like money management workshops, engaging in entrepreneurship and business mentoring. And this is all, you know, really inspiring stuff that goes to show that, you know, it's about going beyond kind of the minimum of compliance and saying this is a really serious issue that affects it all, and how can we all get on the front foot and do as much as we can to help trafficking survivors.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. And I think a really important kind of angle to look at when considering our response. And I think, you know, to all of those senior leaders on the audience today, we've talked about 4 different areas already in terms of how can financial institutions take action to prevent modern slavery in the UK, whether that's, you know, looking at your own businesses and staff and supply chains, whether it's looking at the proceeds of financial crime flowing through the financial networks, whether it's questioning your investment and lending decisions, or as Tom has just talked about, in terms of supporting the victims and helping them kind of rebuild their lives once they've escaped from the trafficking rings that we're talking about here. So I would definitely say there's a huge amount of action that financial institutions of all shapes and sizes can do, whether you're a large international bank or a small accountancy service. There definitely is something here. But I just want to turn back to the audience again. So we're going to do our second poll question here. So the question here, which body do you think carries the most responsibility in driving action towards addressing modern day slavery. So again, that should be up on your screen if everyone can vote away. We've got over 100 attendees, so looking forward to seeing those results. Just whilst you're answering that poll, you know, one of the things we have seen in our research, sadly, is some quite worryingly low levels of awareness across the industry. There are some real champions that we've spoken to, and there's also some fantastic initiatives going on. And as part of our research, you know, we really want to encourage awareness of that as well. One that I want to give a nice example of, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights is a group of 101 investors representing over 4.2 trillion in assets, which calls upon governments to implement and enforce mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. So the group argues that integrating human rights into due diligence makes not just good business sense for companies, but also for investors and governments alike. And I think that's something that we touched on in our earlier conversations, which is so important. Okay, I think we've got the results of the poll in there. Let's have a look. So 54% of participants feel that this is an issue for the government to address. Again, I think kind of actually that is relatively similar to some of the research we've done as part of this study. So in our research, only 34% of respondents said the financial sector should be driving action. Sarah, I think getting kind of senior buy-in and changing attitudes at the highest levels sets the tone for how we can respond to this. Would you agree? And what do you say to senior leaders who are on this call in terms of, you know, taking that action across their businesses?
Thanks, Dickon. And just looking at that poll, I do think it's a partnership between government and business. It's not one or the other, it's got to be both, and that's the way it works most effectively. In terms of businesses in kind of the financial sector, it did strike me when we had the poll that the levels of awareness were really quite low, and they were lower than I expected them to be. And you know, a lot of that is about what are the signals from the top of the shop. You know, what are the C-suite asking questions about? What are they concerned about? And the way in which the sort of senior buy-in or the leadership of an organisation can really make a difference. One of the things that we said in our recent report on retail was that in terms of what the chief exec should be doing, do they in any way kind of celebrate the whistleblowers? Are people who kind of raise concerns, are they the heroes of the organisation? Are they the people you talk about at the water cooler? Or is it all a little bit kind of difficult and embarrassing? So that kind of way in which the leaders set the culture and the tone in an organisation is important. So of course, raising awareness across all levels of employees matters, but I think, you know, the C-suite has a particular role because they set the culture and they set what happens in the organisation.
Absolutely, and I think you know, in all of the discussions we've had so far with the kind of many hundreds of different financial institutions, even the champions, even the ones that are really focused on this issue, will say that the best response is when the CEO is actually personally championing this issue across their business. We do have a number of CEOs, board members, C-suite leaders on this call. So actually, I'd like to make a kind of personal plea here. If I could ask that any leaders on this call take the first step and help us build awareness of this issue. I'd love it if you could talk to your teams about modern slavery and human trafficking, hold a town hall, even if that's a nice wide Zoom call, or you know, send them round the details of this research we're doing if you want to give them some background, and we can help you with any kind of comms or engagement with your teams that you want. What I would love though is if you could all ask all of your staff across the whole of your company to fill out our modern slavery survey. It only takes 5 minutes to fill out, it's only 10 questions long, and it's completely anonymous. But what it will do is help us get to as far and wide across the financial sector as possible, so we can really pick apart those views and opinions and levels of awareness. Okay, Thank you to my panelists. That's been really interesting in terms of kind of highlighting the genesis of the research. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in thick and fast now, which is fantastic. So if I may just start off with some of those audience questions. We've got a first one here from Victoria. Maybe Dame Sara, if I could ask this one to you to start with. What advice would you give an investor confronting potential instances of modern slavery in their supply chain? So would you encourage them to divest from the project or stick with it and engage with the client company in the hope of changing that?
This is a really important issue that comes up time and time again. And when we did our maturity framework, we were saying the very best companies work with their suppliers. They don't just cut them off at the first sign of trouble. They think about how do you kind of cascade ethical standards down the supply chain? How do you work with them? Because if, as soon as there's a problem, a retailer or somebody who is kind of procuring from that supply chain cuts them off, the people who are often the most hurt by that is the poorly paid, abused workers. So we would say if it's kind of issues of labour abuse, you know, there is always that we would always encourage that you work with the supplier. The other issue, of course, is enforcement. So the key organisation here is the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority. They are very keen to gather intelligence and information which they will act on. And there are protocols and different agencies and different organisations about if there are sort of disclosures, how to make sure people are protected and that you don't, in a rather clumsy and blunt way, actually put a victim under more risk, under more threat than they would be. So work with the suppliers would be the first bit of advice, and the Gang Master and Labour Abuse Authority a really good first port of call.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think that's clear. Thank you, Dame Sara. Another one coming in from Ahmed here. Maybe Jonathan, if I could ask you to respond to this one. What are some of the warning signs financial institutions should be looking out for?
Well, yeah, thank you. So this is back to one of those red flags that we should be looking for in the data. I think obviously there's standard things, the bits of data that go with every transaction, how much from whom to whom and when. But if you understand some of the context for that, if you understand what business that they're in, an example would be during COVID, a barbershop shouldn't be doing transactions. But if you're seeing lots of transactions come through for a barbershop, maybe that's a clue that something's going on that shouldn't be. To put it into, I guess, more of a modern slavery example, it's out of hours transactions that are happening, or large movements of cash, or accounts that suddenly all the money comes in or all the money comes out again. And this is something that's a longer discussion about what are these flags to look for, but there are some of the examples, and there are some key ones that we'll see often. But equally, it's not just individual flags, it's the appearance of multiple together in combination that really brings it to life. So sort of a multi-layered approach, and looking at a single transaction won't give you the full story. But looking at collections of transactions over time, you add those together and then you can spot the themes through that. So I guess there's a longer answer to that question that we could discuss later, Ahmed, but in essence, those are some of the things to start.
I think exactly, Jonathan. And Dame Sara, I heard you talk recently about Operation Fort and how uncovering some of the patterns of behaviour really helped the police force kind of realize the scale and nature of that trafficking ring. Is there anything you can share with us to kind of build on that theme of detecting patterns of behaviour that might be relevant?
So there was an important issue in Operation Fort that after the police investigation was well advanced and people had been arrested and therefore the detectives were going to the banks in a particular high street in the West Midlands, quite a few of the banks then sent in suspicious activity reports, but also the bank tellers were saying, oh, we used to watch these guys come along to the cash points every Friday afternoon and take a lot of money out. And nobody had thought, as Jonathan's just said, to kind of put all those bits of information together. It wasn't, the one transaction on its own wasn't necessarily suspicious. It was the fact that these guys were coming every Friday and emptying the accounts of the victims, which in my view should have drawn some suspicion and should have led to early reporting. And I think it links into a much bigger policy issue, which I know government are grappling with, which is the suspicious activity reporting system itself, which is always, I know the banks think it's a huge amount of work, and law enforcement often feel they can't do much with the information they get because it tends to be about one suspicious activity. The sorts of things that Jonathan's talking about using analytics on these big data sets on multiple flags, I think then the banks will be able to give much more insightful and actionable intelligence to law enforcement, so we could do more about it. Because at the end of the day, you know, modern slavery is an economic crime. The perpetrators are just trying to make as much money as possible, and I'm afraid at the moment they see the rewards as extremely high and the risks as pretty low, and we need to do something about that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think there's a huge role that particularly artificial intelligence can play in terms of linking together those streams of data. And we know that modern slavery is a hidden crime, so to speak, so the signs aren't necessarily that obvious. But if you can use technology to kind of drive and link all those flags and patterns of behavior together, then there's some chance to have some good successes here amongst both the private sector and law enforcement, I would imagine. Okay, next question coming in. Apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly. This one is from Angshela. So a question for Tom here. Have any governmental programs proved successful in the reintegration of trafficking survivors so far, especially for the economic empowerment of survivors?
Actually, I think on the broader point, something that we look at a lot at the foundation is there has been a lot of focus around government programs and support in that kind of immediate period following.
Tom, I'm afraid we've lost you there, Tom.
There's been a lot of focus around. I mean, historically, lots of the focus of government support for trafficking victims has been very focused on the identification and short-term support and funding of accommodation and support for trafficking victims in the UK. So I think that is historically what's happened. But I think what we've seen is some really amazing work going on up and down the country to provide longer term support for trafficking victims. I mean, just to pick out one such organisation, Snowdrop is a Sheffield-based charity, and what they do is that they support trafficking victims beyond that kind of initial, very acute residential period where they're requiring very specific support, and supporting them with all aspects of their kind of reintegration into life. And that, you know, ultimately, if you've come from a situation of trafficking, your needs are highly complex and very specific, and it can range from the kind of slightly more complex issue of training and skills to even the kind of most basic issue of, you know, how are you going to get into new accommodation and how are you going to decorate that? And I think what we see is a real opportunity to really focus on that long-term support and focus on the highly unique and specific circumstances of trafficking victims. And I mean, it might make sense to hand over to Dame Sara, because I know this is an area that's kind of a big priority for the Commission, for Dame Sara.
Thanks, Tom. Can I come in there, Dickon? Because I absolutely agree that the longer term support for victims as we help them to become survivors, and what we talk about is helping them to lead lives of sustainable independence, work is absolutely key to this, not least because if you've been abused and victimized through your work, to actually then experience decent work where you're treated properly and you're rewarded for your efforts is really, really important in terms of the psychological recovery, as well as actually earning some money to support yourself. So we think this is really important. I agree with Tom that Snowdrop do some great work. One of the big projects is something which was started by the co-op, which is called Bright Future, where there's quite a lot of big companies, from John Lewis to Vodafone, to, I don't know, probably about 20 blue chip companies you'll have heard of, who provide work placements for survivors. And this they match survivors with these work placements. They're paid, and I think you do something like 3 months, and if that that goes well, then there's a job for you. And I've met survivors who have done that, and actually it's those very basic things about being with colleagues who are supportive, you know, being in a work environment which isn't full of threats and intimidation and fear, but being in a work environment which is actually supportive, and they find it really healing. So it's a great project. I'm very keen that more people should be allowed to do it, because one of the difficulties is quite a few survivors of modern slavery don't have the right to work in this country, and that's something that we are really trying to push government on. But for those who do have the right to work, it's a great scheme and has great results.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Well, listen, I guess continuing on that thread of kind of exploitation of victims, I've got a question here from James. In the UK, the emergence of county lines has a business model that is dependent on exploiting the vulnerable within the UK, predominantly children and mentally challenged adults, addicts, etc., to carry out this risky and illegal activity such as drug muling or money muling, being coerced to carry out violence towards perpetrators, etc., etc. So James notes that this typology of crime costs more lives in the UK than terrorism, but yet does not get the awareness from senior management because of the low value of transactions. So it doesn't kind of fit within their risk profile, so to speak, on that basis. Dame Sara, maybe if I could ask you to pick up first on that question, if you've got any thoughts around that.
So the issue of child criminal exploitation is a growing threat, and I've been doing quite a lot of work on this recently, and we are very concerned about it. County lines, the drug dealing or the money laundering as well, but also forcing children to commit acquisitive crime, begging. There's a whole range of forced criminal exploitation. And I think that support for children who get caught in that is really problematic. We are working with social services, with quite a few of the charities and the NGOs, but on the whole, work with children has always focused on interfamilial abuse, i.e., you know, abuse within the family. What you've got here is the abuse and the exploitation coming from outside the family. There is a kind of a whole growth of an idea called contextual safeguarding, which is thinking about the context of a child. But it's really difficult because, you know, is it right to move a child out of the situation? What about the whole family? If you move the child, do mum and sister come under threats from the traffickers? So we are doing a lot of work trying to really push the need for identification of children who are caught in that, proper referral for support, but also interventions that work and help them. Because what I've seen is that if we don't intervene effectively to begin with, then the child who has been forced to, I don't know, supply drugs in return for a pair of training shoes ends up going up the ladder and dealing more and more drugs, and then maybe even kind of holding the county line, holding the phone line themselves. And that failure of early intervention and protection actually leads to young people being involved in the most serious crime. So I agree, it's a really serious issue. I think you raise a very interesting point, because we're talking about financial crime today, is to what extent have we looked at that business model from the perspective, I guess it's banks, a lot of it's a cash model, but it's not completely cash. And I suspect the way COVID's put so much financial transaction online and made it digital, you know, what has been the impact in terms of county lines? So I'm prompted now to go away and ask colleagues some questions about this. It's the link between county lines and kind of financial crime, because I'm not sure that it has been mined as much. And you may well be right, but because the transaction levels are lower, it maybe doesn't kind of hit the threshold. But maybe Jonathan's got a view about, you know, knowing a little bit about the business model. Is that something that they could think about, red flags that might work?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's more thinking to do on this specific one, but it is one where it's about the aggregation of data and it's about the scenarios more than the individual pieces. Absolutely. But what we do know is that this information can be brought together, and so the evidence can be found and the indicators can be spotted and addressed. So that's work that needs to happen, I think. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think really important that regardless of the kind of size of the transactions, again, you know, we're dealing with a multifaceted global issue here, and it's really important, therefore, that that financial institutions go beyond the question of value and thresholds and really look at this as a social impact that needs to be addressed as well, for I think for the reasons we've discussed. On that kind of sort of linked note, a question from Shelley here, which I might ask Tom to comment on. So why has the social in ESG investor decision-making processes, why has that kind of seemed to have been somewhat on the back burner recently compared to the environmental element of ESG? And is there anything you would like to say about that from an investment perspective?
Well, no, I think that's a really good point, and obviously for very important reasons, there has been a massive focus on the kind of environmental aspects of the ESG. But I think it's definitely true, and I think what recent cases, such as what's happened with Boohoo and other kind of examples of human rights abuses and trafficking have done, it has shown that there is a massive connection between value from an investment point of view and companies that do the right thing. And it's definitely something that I and we at Tribe have always been incredibly passionate about, is thinking, you know, how can we as Tribe, the nutrition business, do as much as we can and have the most positive impact we can as a business. And I suppose we ultimately do that because we think it's the right thing to do, but we also do it because we think increasingly consumers really care and attach value to the way in which businesses do business. And I think what recent examples like Boohoo have shown is that where you invest in businesses that don't have great, or you know, seem to have not great practices around human rights or other social issues, that ultimately this is going to destroy value. So I think it's definitely true that looking backwards, sort of environmental concerns have been front and center, but I think definitely what we see, particularly in kind of more consumer and other sectors, is, and actually people are much more concerned around social issues, and particularly around their kind of due diligence and reporting processes. It's becoming much more relevant for companies to show not just what is the output of what they do, but how do they do it. And you know, I think as increasingly businesses and others are going to need to kind of be much more transparent in that regard. So I think actually I do definitely agree with the question historically, but I think going forwards we think that the S in ESG is going to become ever more important. And I think examples like last week of where value has been destroyed by bad or improper practices, I think the risks of that are going to become ever more clear to business. And so the importance of doing not just what you're required to do, but going well beyond that and demonstrating best practice is going to become ever more important, I think.
Well, perhaps that's the link then, Tom. So regardless of the value, so James, here you talked about county lines and the potential low value of transactions. Regardless of the value, this is increasingly becoming a problem that your investors, your clients, your stakeholders are really concerned about, and they actually want to see how businesses are approaching this from an end-to-end perspective. Now, sadly, I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I'd love to carry this on for a lot longer, but sadly, we're almost out of time. So I want to thank you all for your questions, and thank you to our panelists as well, Dame Sara Thornton, Tom Stancliffe, and Jonathan Bell. Apologies if we haven't got to all of your questions. Our panelists will be live on the Themis Senate after this webinar. So if you've got any more questions, you can continue the conversation by logging on to the Themis Senate and posing them there. And I think you'll see instructions down in the resources tab on the right-hand side of the screen. We've got a couple of minutes, no more than 2-3 minutes left. So just before we go, any final sound bites or thoughts, messages or pleas from our panelists today? So Dame Sara, if I could start with you.
Thanks, Dickon. You know, Men, women, children in this country are forced to work, they're trapped in debt bondage, they're facing intimidation and threats on a daily basis. They are victims of labour exploitation in businesses in this country. And banks and financial institutions are investing in those businesses. That cannot be right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that says it really, really clearly. I think just a final call to action from our side. So our research project is now entering the public outreach and consultation phase. So over the next 5 months, we'll be exploring the findings of this research and talking to the whole industry in a series of focus groups and roundtables. And we want to hear as many different perspectives and build support for taking action to disrupt modern slavery as part of this industry-wide response. The outputs of this research will be wrapped up into a final report published in December. And we also want to make sure that that includes a practical resource and toolkit that you can all use, and the recommendations that come back from the industry will also go back into Dame Sara's ongoing modern slavery strategy as well. I'm very grateful to all of our wonderful guests today. Thankfully, we have over 100 representatives from across the financial sector, from law enforcement, regulators, NGOs, which is really fantastic to see. And please do spread the word and also reach out to me or any of our panelists if you'd like to get involved, either as a participant in this research or as a sponsor or both. I hope this has been an interesting and valuable discussion for you all, and I hope to continue a lot of what we've discussed over the next 5 months. Thank you very much for all of your questions, and look forward to as many of you as possible joining this research program so that together we can fight modern slavery and human trafficking. Thank you all.